I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Well, I'm just about to catch a flight to Colorado. Meanwhile, let's deal with the mystery of the weathered round. SUZANNE Morphew's 4-page autopsy report makes a single reference in its final sentence dealing with external findings on the final page of this weathered round. This word appears nowhere else in the report and is left out of the bulleted summary highlighting the report's main conclusions in the first paragraph of the first page. If the autopsy report is dismissive of a bullet slug found near the remains, Barry Morphew's defense have been careful to highlight it. But what's really missing from this picture? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're enjoying this analysis, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So it may be too soon to draw certain conclusions. It's not clear whether the autopsy report is abbreviated. It's not clear whether there's additional evidence that they've just sort of glossed through. And if there's a lot more evidence, to what extent is there a lot more evidence? No mention is made, for example, of blood on Suzanne's clothing, just that the clothing, specifically the hoodie, was found ripped and dirty. Was there any kind of staining on that clothing? Now, in a scenario involving firearms, bullet wounds, and clothing, we would expect extensive blood loss. When someone suffers a gunshot wound, there's extensive bleeding, and that blood then stains the clothing. We saw all of this in the Rust incident. And so we'd expect the grey hoodie, if Suzanne was wearing it when shot, to look like Helena's shirt. So is there any of that? Is there any evidence of blood in the clothing? The other thing we'd want to look at is damaged bones, and it's the same thing also in the Rust incident. You could see in the autopsy, you could trace the path of the bullet as it hit bone and left behind mechanical damage on its way through the body. So yes, we would expect a bullet to damage bones as it passes through the body, and you would expect the bullet to sort of crack and shatter bone in ways that something like a tooth wouldn't do. A tooth might grind or slightly indent a bone, whereas a bullet would, because it's much harder but also moving at a greater speed, would cause more significant and kind of classical damage to the bone, right? And so is there any evidence of that? And if there is, you would actually be able to track that bullet going through the body, and you'd expect it to hit one bone and then another bone in its path and so on. And so let's just say if a bullet is able to pass right through the body, in other words, if it doesn't hit any bone, well, this is obviously indicative of the bullet missing all bones, and so then the slug should be found elsewhere, outside the body. But since a round was found, that suggests the bullet was found with the body, and that suggests that it must have hit bone, right? Unless the defense are suggesting Suzanne was shot in the field outside Moffat, it's certainly strange that the slug is there at all. Intertextually, there are at least 2 cases where we see the path of the bullet and that its trajectory is significantly altered by smashing into bone. The slug itself is also damaged in this process, so one would also want to look at that slug under the microscope to see whether there's any of that kind of damage. Now, we saw this with Alina Hutchins, where the bullet passed under her armpit, hit her rib, pierced her lung, and struck her spine. The slug exited and slammed into Director Joel Sousa's shoulder, where the bullet came to rest in the bones of his shoulder. Now, nowhere in the autopsy is there any indication of the idiosyncratic damage of a bullet into bones. That's in terms of Suzanne Morphew. One might say that animals interfering, teeth marks and weathering could interfere with that process. Did you know that Vincent van Gogh's body was exhumed, and in his case the pea-sized bullet recovered? The doctor who exhumed his body, he was a military doctor, he was also a specialist in autopsies, determined the path of the bullet, basically went on a similar trajectory as the one that killed Helena. It missed all of the artist's major organs, it glanced off a rib and hit his spine. It remained embedded in his body, which is why the bullet was recovered with the artist's bones at the time. Now, if you think about it, Suzanne's killer probably expected the bullet to tell the full story in the event that her remains were ever found. In other words, people would assume the bullet was the cause of death. Well, that's not what's in the autopsy. He probably didn't expect that chemicals would be stored in the marrow of her bones, which would paint a very different picture. And I have to say, I think everyone was surprised by this. Everyone was shocked that the toxicology, after 3 years out in the wilderness, would still be so detailed and specific. 3 different compounds that were identified. Now, in other words, it's possible that the weathered bullet was staged, just like the unblooded clothing is staged, and the bicycle helmet was staged. So why would a killer go to the trouble to stage this, especially the bicycle aspect, if his presence in the area would immediately raise suspicion? This is what I mean. You know, I've driven to the Puma Path home. Driving is about the only way you get there. It's just basically wilderness. And it's rough, it's sort of mountainous and wooded. And there's quite a fast-flowing stream. And the only way you can really get there is a single dirt road in and out. You wouldn't want to waste time in that area if you weren't from the area. You certainly wouldn't want to waste time stopping to throw a bicycle down an embankment. If that's what you wanted to do, you could do it somewhere else. It would be certainly a risk to do that very close to that area if you weren't from that area. Now, when I drove down there, another vehicle approached, and I think there are at least 2 homes in that area. And it's not possible to drive very fast due to 1-lane bridges. There are also windy dirt roads and blind risers. So the question remains, why would the killer go to so much trouble to stage the crime and the remains? Another crime with elaborate staging is the JonBenet Ramsey case, which occurred in the same state, Colorado. So what is staging typically trying to hide? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.